One family once owned so much of New York City that they collected rent from nearly 500 buildings at the same time. One man from that family died holding a fortune so large it equaled 1% of the entire American economy. In today's terms, that is over $100 billion. And yet today, not a single Astor appears on any list of the wealthiest people in America. Not one. The mansions are gone. The land is gone. The empire is gone. All that remains is a name on a hotel that someone else owns. This is the story of how the greatest fortune ever built in the United States quietly disappeared without a single crash, without a single scandal, and without anyone outside the family ever noticing it was going until it was already too late. Subscribe right now, because what destroyed the Astors is happening to fortunes all over the world right now. And by the time this video ends, you will understand exactly how it works and why almost nobody sees it coming. Let us start at the beginning. John Jacob Astor arrived in America in the 1780s with almost nothing. He was the son of a butcher from a small town in Germany. He had very little money, almost no English, and no connections to anyone who mattered in the country he had just stepped into. What he had instead was something rarer and more valuable than any of those things. He had the ability to look at something small and see the empire hidden inside it. He started in furs, not managing a company or sitting behind a desk. He was buying animal pelts from trappers with his own hands and selling them into markets in Europe, where fashionable people paid serious money for beaver skin hats and fur-lined coats. He was hauling the goods himself. He was sleeping rough. He was sitting across the table from hard, experienced trappers who had spent their lives in the wilderness, and he was negotiating with them and winning. Within 20 years of arriving with almost nothing, he owned the trade. In 1808, Astor founded the American Fur Company. Then he did something that every great fortune builder eventually figures out. He got the government working in his favor instead of against him. A law passed in 1816 barred foreign-born people from participating in the fur business on American soil. A separate law in 1822 shut down the government's own fur trading posts. Between those two pieces of legislation, Astor ended up with something that every businessman in history has dreamed of, a near monopoly handed to him by the legal system itself. His company ruled the American fur trade through the 1820s and 1830s, and the money poured in. He also built serious wealth through the China trade, sending ships across the Pacific loaded with goods that sold in Asian markets, and bringing back products that commanded premium prices back home. By every measure, John Jacob Astor was not a pleasant man to deal with. He squeezed his suppliers, he undercut competitors with patience and calculation that people around him described as almost cold. He pushed his operations into every territory they could reach. But what separated him from every other hard businessman of his era was the next decision he made. When the fur trade was at its absolute peak, he looked at it and got out. He could see what was coming before everyone else could. Fashions change. Beaver hats were not going to be fashionable forever. The animals were being trapped faster than they could reproduce. Other traders stayed in and eventually went broke when the market collapsed. Astor read the situation accurately, sold at the top, and walked away rich. That is an extraordinarily rare ability. Most people fall in love with the thing that made them wealthy. They hold it too long because selling feels like betrayal. Astor had no such attachment. He was not in love with furs. He was in love with staying rich. And he had already identified what was going to keep him richer than anything else he had ever tried. He wanted land. Not just any land. He wanted Manhattan. Starting in the 1830s, Astor began systematically converting his fortune from furs and shipping into New York City real estate. The strategy he used was so simple that it sounds almost too obvious to be the secret behind the greatest fortune in American history. He bought land at the northern edge of the growing city, out where the grid had not yet reached, where the plots were farmland and empty lots that nobody else saw much value in. He bought them cheap. Then he sat and waited while the city grew northward, the way it always was going to, turning his cheap farmland into some of the most valuable blocks in the fastest growing city on earth. And here is the critical part that made this approach a genuine money machine rather than just a smart property play. He did not sell the land. He leased it. Astor would rent a plot to a tenant on a long-term lease, often around 21 years, and allow the tenant to pay for and build whatever structure they wanted on top of it. The tenant put up the building. Astor collected the rent and continued to own the ground underneath. When the lease expired, the building itself reverted to Astor, who could then demand far higher rent based on the value the growing city had added to the location, or take the structure for a fraction of what it was worth. He was capturing the rising value of New York without having to build anything himself. He was essentially sitting still and letting the city make him richer year after year automatically. By the 1840s, this approach was generating around $200,000 annually from approximately 470 active leases. And that number kept climbing as the city kept growing. He had built a machine that printed money indefinitely, and it required almost nothing from him to keep running. When John Jacob Astor died in 1848, he was the richest man in America. But before he died, he made one decision that would prove to be the most important thing he ever did for his family, though they would later forget why it mattered. He had a problem that plagues every dynasty. His eldest son was simply not capable of managing what his father had built. So Astor broke with the common tradition of dividing a fortune among all of his children and passed the overwhelming bulk of the estate to his second son, William Backhouse Astor. He kept the empire in one pair of capable hands. That single decision, preserving the whole instead of slicing it into pieces, was the thing that allowed the family to remain at the top for even another generation. And it is the exact decision that no one in the family would repeat after him. William Backhouse Astor became known as the landlord of New York. He did not squander what his father left him. He built on it seriously and steadily, buying more property and adding to the lease portfolio. And by the time he died in 1875, he had more than doubled the fortune to somewhere approaching $100 million. At one point in the 1860s, he was estimated to own more than 700 individual houses in Manhattan, and sat millions ahead of whoever came second on the list of the city's wealthiest residents. But here is where you can see the first sign of what is going to happen to the family, if you know what to look for. William Backhouse was a very good caretaker. He maintained the machine his father built and made it larger. But he was not a hunter in the way his father was. John Jacob Astor had seen opportunities that nobody else could see and seized them with aggression and creativity. His son managed what existed. 2 generations in, the family was coasting on the rent machine without rebuilding the instinct that created it. And coasting is always the first step toward falling. The 3rd generation made a much more consequential error in judgment. They stopped thinking about money altogether and started thinking about something they found far more interesting, deciding who mattered in American society. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor, the wife of a grandson of the founder, looked at the position the Astor family occupied and decided that being the richest family in America was not a sufficient crown to wear. The Astors would also be the most important family, the family that decided who belonged and who did not in polite American society. In the Gilded Age, when enormous new fortunes were appearing all across the country from railroads, steel, and oil, and all of that new money was desperately seeking respectability, that was a genuinely powerful position to occupy. Caroline Astor made herself the undisputed queen of New York's social world. She threw an annual January ball that became the most important event of the entire social season. An invitation was a form of social certification. Being left off the list meant you did not exist, and the list was everything. Her enforcer in this operation was a social climber named Ward McAllister, who appointed himself the official referee of fashionable society, and together with Caroline developed the concept that would make them famous, the 400. McAllister announced publicly in 1888 that there were only about 400 people in New York City who truly mattered in society. Everyone else was, by definition, a nobody. You have probably heard the explanation for that number. The story says 400 was precisely how many people fit inside Mrs. Astor's ballroom. It is a satisfying story. It is also not true. Historians cannot connect the number to her ballroom at all, and where it actually came from remains unclear. And here is the part almost nobody knows. When McAllister finally published the official list in the New York Times in 1892, it did not contain 400 names. It contained fewer than that, with some names misspelled and some belonging to people who were already dead. The newspapers had a field day and started calling him Make-A-Lister. The most exclusive list in America could not count to its own headline number, but the power behind the theater was real, even if the performance was sometimes embarrassing. And the most vivid demonstration of that power came from the family that eventually replaced the Astors at the very top of American wealth, the Vanderbilts. The Vanderbilts had more money than almost anyone in the country, built from a railroad and shipping empire of extraordinary size. But to Caroline Astor, they were new money, trade money, not the right kind of people. She refused to acknowledge them socially. In 1883, Alva Vanderbilt responded to this snub by throwing the most spectacular costume ball New York had ever seen, the kind of event that dominated every conversation in the city for weeks before it happened. Then she let it quietly be known that Mrs. Astor's own daughter, who had been rehearsing a dance for the party for weeks with her friends, would not be receiving an invitation. The reason given was simple. Mrs. Astor had never called on the Vanderbilts in the formal social manner, which meant the two families were not acquainted, and therefore the Vanderbilt daughter could not in good conscience invite someone she had never officially met. To get her daughter through that door, Caroline Astor was forced to leave her calling card at the Vanderbilt mansion, the formal act of recognition. The Queen of New York society blinked first. The Vanderbilts were in, and the gates that the Astors had built and guarded had now been passed by the very family that would outlast them completely. While Caroline Astor was perfecting the guest list for dinner parties, something far more dangerous was developing inside the family itself, and it began with a dispute over who had the right to call herself Mrs. Astor. By the 1890s, there were two women in the family who each believed they held that title: Caroline, the reigning social queen, and Mary, the wife of William Waldorf Astor, who held the largest single share of the family fortune. The two branches of the family fell into a bitter feud over the name and the social position it carried. And William Waldorf Astor, exhausted by losing a social war to his aunt, and convinced that America had become an impossible country for a man of his standing, made a decision that nobody around him fully understood at the time. He left. In 1891, he packed up the largest single pool of the family's accumulated wealth and moved to England permanently. He became a British subject. He bought Cliveden, one of the great English country houses, and later Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, and poured serious money into restoring both. The British crown would eventually make him a viscount. Everyone in America at the time read this as a rich man throwing a tantrum and running away. What they missed was that he had just walked his share of the fortune into the most effective wealth preservation machine that had ever existed in the Western world. Back in New York, the two branches of the family found a way to express their contempt for each other at enormous expense. William Waldorf, before departing for England, demolished his Fifth Avenue mansion, which sat directly next to his Aunt Caroline's home, and built a hotel on the site, partly to ruin her view and the quality of her daily life. It was called the Waldorf. Caroline's son, John Jacob Astor IV, responded by tearing down his own mother's mansion after she moved uptown and building a taller hotel immediately adjacent to the Waldorf. He called it the Astoria. The two hotels were eventually joined into one with a marble corridor connecting them, and a legal clause in the agreement specifying that the corridor could be bricked up if the families fell out again. The richest family in America had reached the point where its members were demolishing their own properties to win arguments with their relatives. The contrast with the founder is almost painful. John Jacob Astor would never have destroyed a productive asset to score a point against a cousin. He bought things and held them and let the city make them more valuable decade after decade. His grandchildren were tearing down mansions and building spite hotels and writing clauses about hallways into legal agreements. Then came April 1912. John Jacob Astor IV was aboard the Titanic on its maiden voyage. He was the wealthiest passenger on the ship. When the ship went down, he went with it. His young wife survived and gave birth to his son several months later. His fortune, roughly $85 million, passed to his 20-year-old son Vincent. Vincent Astor did something no previous Astor had done. He looked at the fortune and started selling it. The old system of collecting rent from dense urban tenements was becoming harder to defend socially and financially. The Great Depression devastated the family's holdings in the theater district and around Times Square. And Vincent, to his credit, understood that the rent machine his family had coasted on for decades was losing steam. He sold large portions of the empire that 4 generations had assembled. Each sale was a subtraction from which there was no recovery. Every block sold was a block that would never again throw off Astor rent. The family that had spent a century buying Manhattan without selling was now selling Manhattan without buying. The direction of the entire enterprise had reversed, and the physical monuments to the family's greatness were coming down one by one. The great Astor Mansion on Fifth Avenue was demolished in the 1920s. Temple Emmanuel stands on that spot today. The original Waldorf Astoria Hotel was torn down in 1929 to make way for the Empire State Building. Vincent died in 1959 without children. An illness in his youth had left him unable to have them. The main line of the greatest fortune in American history simply ran out of Astors to pass it to. He left the bulk of what remained to a charitable foundation. His half-brother received a settlement from the will of $250,000, $250,000, from a fortune that had once equaled 1% of the United States economy. So where did the money go? Not to a villain, not to a collapse or a fraud. It went the way almost every great fortune goes when nobody's watching the structure. It leaked out slowly, over generations, through a hole the family never bothered to close. The mechanism is straightforward and worth understanding clearly because it is the same thing that destroys most large accumulations of wealth at every level. John Jacob Astor built a machine that generated money. His son maintained the machine and made it larger. But after those 2 generations, nobody was building anything new. The family was living on the output of what the founder created and assuming the output would last forever. A fortune that is not being actively rebuilt is simply being slowly spent, no matter how large it starts. That alone would have been enough to eventually reduce the Astors from extraordinary to ordinary. But underneath that was a structural failure that accelerated everything. The Astors never built a system to hold the fortune together as one unit across generations. The founder had done it once by instinct, passing the empire to a single capable son instead of dividing it among all his children. But that was a one-time judgment call, not a formal structure. After him, each generation divided the wealth among more children, who divided it again among more children of their own. There was no family trust, no holding company, no family office managing the whole pile as a single enterprise with a stated goal of preserving it across time. So what started as a concentrated fortune of extraordinary size got carved into progressively smaller shares at every generation. Federal estate taxes arrived and took a cut at every death. Land that looked valuable on paper but generated limited cash had to be sold just to pay the tax owed when an heir died. The heirs were simultaneously receiving smaller shares and being forced to liquidate assets to meet their obligations. 100 captains each steering their own small boat in their own direction, with no fleet and no admiral. That is not a structure for preserving an empire. That is a structure for dispersing one. And here is the lesson the story leaves you with, because this is not really about the Astors. The branch of the family that moved to England and that everyone in America laughed at for fleeing in a social huff did every single thing the American branch failed to do. William Waldorf Astor walked his fortune into the British aristocratic system, which by design passes wealth to a single heir rather than dividing it among all children. The estate at Cliveden was handed to the National Trust in 1942 with a significant endowment, locking it out of reach of division and inheritance taxes in a permanent stroke. The assets were protected in structures that outlasted any individual family member's judgment or greed. The current Viscount Astor, the direct descendant of the man everyone called a quitter, is worth several $100 million today and still lives on the family estates. Same blood, same starting money. Two entirely different endings. The only variable was whether anyone built a structure to hold the fortune together or left it sitting in the open where time and division could work on it. The families that keep great fortunes across generations treat the money like an institution with rules and trustees and a plan that outlives any single person's decisions. The families that lose great fortunes treat the money like a personal bank account, something to enjoy now and divide later. The Astors had more money than almost anyone in American history, and they still lost it. Because a fortune without structure is not a dynasty, it is a countdown. Let us slow down on a few of these moments and give them the depth they deserve, because the surface-level story of the Astors is interesting enough. But the detail underneath each chapter is where the real lessons live. Consider what John Jacob Astor actually understood about the fur trade that his competitors did not. It was not just that he was harder working or more aggressive, though he was both of those things. It was that he saw the business as a temporary vehicle and not a permanent destination. Most of the traders around him had built their identities around the fur business. It was who they were, not just what they did. When the market eventually turned against them, they stayed because leaving would have felt like losing themselves. Astor had no such confusion. He was in the business to accumulate capital. Once he had accumulated enough capital, the business itself became optional. The money was the goal. The fur trade was just the path to it. That distinction between the vehicle and the destination is what separated him from everyone else in his industry. And it is the same distinction that most people who inherit wealth never have to develop, because they did not have to build anything from nothing to get what they have. The genius of the Manhattan real estate strategy goes deeper than most people appreciate when they first hear it explained. The leasing model Astor used was not just a clever way to hold onto land. It was a way of letting other people's ambition and capital work for him. When he leased a plot to a tenant and allowed that tenant to build a structure on the land, the tenant was doing all the work and taking all the risk of construction. If the building turned out to be a bad investment for the tenant, that was the tenant's problem. Astor still owned the ground underneath. If the building turned out to be successful and the tenant built something valuable on the site, Astor captured that value too when the lease expired and the property reverted to him. Heads, he wins. Tails, the tenant loses. That asymmetry, where most of the risk sits on one side and most of the long-term reward sits on the other, is the hallmark of every truly great business structure. You see the same logic in franchise models and patent licensing and platform businesses. The Astors discovered it in 1830s Manhattan real estate, and it made them the wealthiest family in America. The reason the leasing model eventually began to break down is also instructive. Long-term ground leases work beautifully when the city around them keeps growing and the surrounding land keeps appreciating. New York did exactly that for decades, and the Astor fortune grew with the city as automatically as compound interest grows a bank account. But the model requires one thing above all others to keep working. It requires someone actively managing the portfolio, renegotiating leases, reinvesting the cash flow into new acquisitions, and staying ahead of changes in the city's development patterns. John Jacob Astor did all of that himself. William Backhouse. Astor managed the existing portfolio competently, but after those two generations, the active management became passive collection. The family started receiving the rent without thinking about what to do with it beyond spending it, and a machine that is not being maintained eventually stops working as well as it did when someone was paying attention. The social chapter of the Astor story is often told as if it were simply a vanity project, a family that got bored with business and started playing games with dinner party invitations. That reading is too simple. Caroline Astor's social empire was a real power structure. In the Gilded Age, social legitimacy was worth something concrete. New industrial fortunes were desperate to convert raw money into the kind of respectability that opened political doors, business partnerships, and marriage alliances with established families. Caroline Astor was the gatekeeper of that conversion process. She had genuine leverage over people who had more money than she did, but who wanted what only she could give them. The annual ball was not just a party, it was a market, and she ran it. What she got wrong was the economics of that market over time. Social legitimacy is a product that becomes less scarce as money becomes more plentiful. When one industrial fortune wants respectability and you control access to it, you have enormous power. When 500 industrial fortunes want respectability, the shortage starts to resolve itself whether you cooperate or not. The Vanderbilts proved that point precisely. They did not need Caroline Astor's permission in any deep sense. They simply organized a party so magnificent that refusing to go to it became more socially costly than the snub of attending. The Astors' social power was real, but it had a natural expiration date that nobody in the family recognized until the date had already passed. There is also a financial cost to the social empire that is easy to overlook. Every dollar spent on marble mansions, elaborate balls, armies of household servants, and the general upkeep of the most conspicuous standard of living in America was a dollar not going back into the rent machine. The original wealth generation model required almost nothing. Buy land, wait, collect rent, repeat. The social performance model required enormous ongoing expenditure just to maintain the appearance that justified the position. The Astors were not exactly being reckless. By the standards of the Gilded Age, they were doing exactly what families of their position were expected to do. But the expected behavior of their class happened to be exactly the wrong behavior for preserving the fortune over time. The pressure to perform wealth at a certain level was quietly undermining the fortune that funded the performance. The Titanic moment deserves more attention than it usually gets in the Astor story, not because of the tragedy of the shipwreck itself, but because of what it revealed about the state of the fortune at that point. John Jacob Astor IV was aboard as one of the wealthiest passengers on the most celebrated ship in the world. He was living at the absolute peak of Gilded Age extravagance. His estate at the time of his death was valued at roughly $85 million. That is a number that sounds impressive until you remember that his great-great-grandfather had died with a fortune that, in proportional terms, was worth more than $100 billion in today's money. In 4 generations, the Astors had gone from owning roughly 1% of the entire American economy to being very wealthy by normal standards, but completely eclipsed by the new fortunes being built around them. The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans, these were the names at the top of the wealth tables by then. The Astors had not been robbed or swindled. They had simply stood still while the world built larger fortunes around them, and standing still is always a form of going backward. Vincent Astor's decision to sell large portions of the family's Manhattan holdings is the most debated chapter of the story among people who study it seriously. Some historians argue he was pragmatic. The Depression was genuinely devastating to urban real estate, and getting out ahead of the worst of it was the right call. Others argue that a family with the Astor portfolio's long-term track record should have found ways to hold through the downturn rather than converting the most durable asset they possessed into cash that could be spent. Both arguments have merit. What is not debatable is the outcome. Every asset sold was a permanent subtraction from what the family could pass forward. The rent machine that had run for a century was being disassembled piece by piece, and nothing was being built to replace it. Vincent's childlessness is the final chapter, and in some ways the most honest one. A man who spends his life as the last competent stay-ward of a dynasty and ends up leaving the bulk of what remains to a charitable foundation rather than to family members has made a judgment about his own family. He looked at the relatives available to inherit and apparently concluded that putting the money into hospitals and parks and libraries would produce better outcomes for the world than putting it in the hands of the people he knew. That is a quiet verdict, delivered without public statement. The charitable foundation did genuine good work in New York for decades, but it was also the formal acknowledgement that the dynasty was over. The Astors had been the family that decided who mattered in America. In the end, they decided, through Vincent's will, that their own name was not the most important thing their money could serve. The British branch stands as the proof that none of this was inevitable. Same family, same original fortune. The branch that everyone laughed at for leaving became the branch that survived. They used formal legal structures to protect assets from division and taxation. They handed properties to institutions in ways that preserved the Astor connection to them permanently. They operated with a generational time horizon rather than managing quarter to quarter.